It's unconscionable that we have policies in place where people cannot have a living wage.
Yeah.
Those policies are all predicated on, I'm afraid that if I give what I feel I need to secure myself, then there's not enough to go around.
And so when you talk about the not mattering,
Yeah.
when you talk about understanding the finitude,
Yeah.
in the sense the church becomes the perfect breeding ground to maintain the
Yes.
ideas of racism, right?
Yes.
Because whether it's in evangelism, whether it's in the taking of the Eucharist every week, where it's talking about the calendar year is about the birth, the death, and the resurrection.
Yeah.
The cycle of life.
Yeah.
Right.
Yes.
It becomes a perfect place
Yes.
for racism to continue.
Yes.
And we see it in modes of the type of music that's constantly, well, we don't want to sing that because that's not really of importance, or you try to maintain certain music or certain certain versions of the Bible, certain people in positions of power, because if not, you no longer matter.
Yes.
Right? And so the church, which sometimes has a monolithic idea. One of the things that you talked about finitude, we constantly see the Pew Research come out with statistics. You constantly hear all this information about how many nuns, or how the nuns are growing.
Yeah.
And then those who have faith, those who call themselves Christians, begin to go to go down.
Yeah.
So then you have the existential crisis, right? What happens when the predominant faith is no longer right the one in top? And what does that mean when you're no longer praying in schools or you're praying in these religious places where you once had power?
Right.
So if you can't maintain power there, where is the other place you can maintain power? In your own institution, in your own sphere.
Yes. Yeah, that's very well said. Now, so all that you're describing are actually, it's a defensive use to defend against this fear of nothingness, this fear of I don't matter, of religion, of God talk, of faith. Now, I mentioned the group earlier. So we often confuse the group, because it's bigger than us, with God.
Yeah.
That's a form of idolatry. This is the story of the prophets in the Hebrew Bible. And Jesus himself, no, it's not all these rules, it's not all these liturgies where God lives in. If you oppress the poor, if you exploit people in the name of doing that.
Yeah.
We all have a desire to belong, right? There's nothing wrong with it. Again, relationality is really important. Community is really important. But when community becomes kind of fossilized into, we're just trying to calm this fear by playing God, and so you can never touch this or that, then, we basically have obsessive compulsive forms of faith. And now to get to your point about the nuns, many people are opting out of this because they say, the one thing that you say you have to offer is making us moral beings. What you're doing in the name of God is not moral.
It's immoral.
Yeah, child sexual abuse, racism.
Yeah.
That's not moral. You are not credible.
Yeah.
We can't do this. And so that's why they leave.
But that's not all churches, right?
I know, no, it's not all church.
Yeah, but I say that tongue in cheek because even if it's not your religious institution that does it, it's the same type of power that allows it to happen.
Yes.
Right? So you'll say, oh, it's just this person. So again, you otherize that person.
Right.
And you separate yourself, right? Because the fear is,
Yeah.
if I'm associated in that way, then I now become just like that particular person. So you perpetuate that fear over and over again in multiple ways.
Yes.
If I follow.
Yes. Now I have to say something important here so that I'm not being misunderstood. This play with God images isn't just something that is active in faith communities that are explicitly faith communities. This is something, you can play God without ever referring to God. Our large corporations are playing God in the world. They may never mention God. When you act omnipotently and you treat others as nothing, you are, whether you know it or not, are living by a violent God image, by an annihilating God image. That's really important, and I'm partly saying this because, I'm familiar with some of the so-called new atheists, like Richard Dawkins or Christopher Hitchens or Sam Harris. And when, the Iraq War was being waged, Christopher Hitchens, who has already died a few years ago, he was all defending the Iraq War in the name of atheism. So you can, instead of God, you can use morality. You can use morality and say, or you can say, okay, we're doing this for manifest destiny, basically, we're doing this for spreading democracy. So we bombed democracy into other countries, right? What we did in Vietnam, right?
That didn't work.
It didn't work. Afghanistan didn't work. 20 years of bombing Afghanistan, trying to create democracy, and we very often, this is the tricky piece about taking the fruit. Very often we think of morality as the fruit. We say, oh, this is good for people. Yeah. We're spreading democracy. We're going to help women have equal rights in Afghanistan. Well, once we have chewed them out right now, we're not caring about the women anymore there. What has happened? We're leaving them in the lurch.
Yeah.
It wasn't about the women and children in Afghanistan. And often you only see this afterwards. Now, I want to read a quote.
Okay.
A quote from a Bishop Meade. He was a 19th century bishop in Virginia. And I want to read this because I think it kind of exemplifies sort of what's in the background, especially of white Christian nationalism and of the power dynamics that to this day are kept alive in this country. Not explicitly like this anymore, but unconsciously in many respects. So this was Bishop Meade in the 19th century in Virginia, and this can be found in Harriet Beecher Stowe's A Key to Uncle Tom's Cabin. And so Bishop Meade writes there to slaves. This is what he wrote. Almighty God hath been pleased to make you slaves here, and to give you nothing but labor and poverty in the world, which you are obliged to submit to, as it is in his will, meaning God's, that it would be so. If therefore you would be God's freemen in heaven, you must be good and strive to serve him here on earth. I say that what faults you are guilty of towards your masters and mistresses are faults done against God himself, who hath set your masters and mistresses over you in his own stead, and expects you to do for them just as you would do for him. You can't make this stuff up. This is what I call a narcissistic God image, where the master, or today the white supremacist, conflates themselves with God and says, you are my extension. You are my servant. You can be the suffering servant. You have to take your cross upon yourself, right? Your poverty is really given by God. That is a very harmful use of Christian theology. But that, in my view, to this day, underpins poverty wages. We treat people as if they don't deserve more.
Yeah.
There is no reason, absolutely no reason, why we would have poor people in this country. What I suggest that churches do, that churches talk to the power brokers in the churches. Most of the people that make policies are in churches. They are in state assemblies. Yeah. They're senators. They're representatives. They have a responsibility to give up this inflated, violent God image, to do real soul searching, to do analysis of how are we implementing this violent God image to keep people in misery. And how are we fighting our sense of insignificance by making other people insignificant through policies? That's what needs to happen. And the church has a responsibility to have these kinds of conversations. And so I think there should be councils in churches where power brokers do work on their own violent God images. Now here's the problem with a lot of this is, when we approach this whole thing just from a moral perspective, there will be no progress. That is a big problem. Because moralizing creates shame. Shame reinforces, I'm bad, I'm insignificant. So you just feed the vicious cycle. So no one's going to come to the table if you say to them, you're bad. That's why what you said initially at the beginning is so important. It's not that we blame any single person. We're all in this system together. Yeah. The Black Lives Matter movement has something on their website about healing justice. And they actually argue one of the pillars of healing justice is we need to fight the scarcity principle, the idea of scarcity. Then healing can be possible. So we basically need to say back to the serpent, to the voice of fear in us, that that says there's not enough to go around. That's not true. There's always enough to go around. We need trust. We need faith. Because what you see in Genesis 2, that leads all the way to Genesis 11, you see that after Cain kills Abel in this competition for mattering, Cain kills Abel because...
I work too, right?
No, he says, I work too, but he felt that Abel mattered more to God. Yeah. That's already a violent God image. So we have to read the Bible that way too. We can't just say, okay, this is how God is. What we have to read the Bible as is, the Bible is showing us how people struggled with violent God images and how then they discovered again the faith of Abraham. So what happens in Genesis 2 to 11 actually is that it gets more and more and more out of hand. To war, Nimrod, to then the Tower of Babel, where we try through all kind of so-called kumbaya, right? So-called
build the tower
through our own efforts. And then God looks kind of down, and it's very funny, right?
Yeah,
how God sort of says, no, this is not God, you're not God. Yeah. But it's not in a again, it shouldn't be violent, it's more like this all will come to an end. It's like a card house that falls in. And so then a new start needs to happen. And so that's exactly what's in that passage of Luke 14 also meant. We have to let go of these inflated, violent God images. We have to get in touch with our true fears. We have to get in touch with our shame. We shouldn't shame people into, oh, you're bad or something like that. That doesn't mean that we can't name immorality. That's not what that means. And that doesn't mean that we can't do justice. That's not what that means. But if we really want to change, we have to help people lose fear. Now, this is on the people who are in power, right? So it's not as, I've been reading recently Resmaa Menaken's book, My Grandmother's Hands, which is a book I highly recommend. Resmaa Menaken talks about how the trauma of racism is really held in the body of everyone. right?
Yeah.
So it's, we have the fear of annihilation, we have the defense of playing God, then we project it onto others as, oh, you are the insignificant one, I'm not. And as a result of all of that, we have the cycle of trauma. And that affects everyone. It affects the people that are treated as nothing, but it also affects the people that are doing it in the trauma cycle. Because as he talks about, his brother is a police officer, he is an African-American somatic therapist, and he presents in this book ideas where he says we hold that racist trauma. Everyone holds it in our body. I want to say this, as we work on racism and on institutional racism as well, what we have to do is we have to work on that trauma. Now, he argues we have to look at our bodies, what happens in our bodies, because very often, and this is very significant, what you see, for instance, in police shootings, so often the defense was, I was afraid for my life.
Yeah. And it's justified when you have fear. You justify the shooting.
Right.
You justify it, yeah.
Yeah. Now, what he points out, though, this is a very complicated matter, because what happens is we have created a racist culture, and we have created certain power dynamics where the image of the other has been portrayed as like the devil.
Yeah.
And so you're terribly afraid of the devil. And so if the fear is raised to that level, what happens is a lot of this is not conscious. What happens is that actually he calls it the lizard brain, like what comes from our brainstem.
The fight-flight recess.
Fight-flight, yeah. And so that what we call the neocortex gets sort of out of commission, and that we act before we're conscious of what we're doing.
Yeah.
And that has grounding in research. That because in terms of the brain, what happens is when we are afraid, there actually, and I'm saying this for a very important reason here, there are two pathways in which fear in a dangerous situation gets to what we call the amygdala, which is sort of the place that signals to the body then what to do. It sets that in motion. So the first way is a direct way. So let's say you stepped on the street out there, and all of a sudden car comes around the corner, and you basically have an automatic fear reflex, right?
Yeah.
That's a direct response. So the danger signal first got to your thalamus, and then there's a direct signal to the amygdala that says, act. And you're not even aware that this is happening. You just automatically do it. You fight, flight, or freeze, right?
Yeah.
That's one form of responding to a danger. But we as humans have or also higher animals have that as well to some degree, but we have it in a very specific way, is we have the neocortex, so that let's say you have that car coming around you thought the car is coming around the corner, but actually it was the shadow of maybe a plane crossing over you and some other thing that made you think it's a car, and then you realize that, and what happens there is at the same time as that direct stimulus is going to the amygdala, there's another pathway that's going from the thalamus that receives the external stimulus to the neocortex, the thinking part, and that assesses the situation better, gives more correct information, and then puts it to the amygdala, and the amygdala then gives, okay, we can stop the warning here, right? You don't really have to be afraid. So what happens in racism, unfortunately, is that we have created a culture, a societal feeling that is traumatic. We're living in a traumatized society.
Yeah. Oh.
And so all of us, and so he points out that it's persons of color, that it's white people, that it's blue people, right? The first responders. We all live in this culture of fear and racism. And so what he argues is we need to listen to our body and do somatic work so that we are not as afraid, that our lizard brain doesn't just act this fast. Now, what I would like to add from my perspective, from a theological perspective, is what is very important. I think we need to take that neocortex and take a closer look at it, because what happens when we have this radical fear response is not just from our lizard brain. Because animals do not do final solutions. Hitler, as a human being, thought, we have to do final solutions, eradicate all people. An animal will just, okay, let's get out of my way, and if you go out of my way, I'm not going to follow you and hunt you down. That's not what animals do. We humans create final solutions because we want to eradicate death forever. That's what we do. And we do that because we have, and this is very important, we have self-reflective consciousness. So our neocortex is not just, it gives like, okay, we think a little bit about it here, but what we actually do is and this is where God images come in, this is how God images in the first place are formed actually. You can think of our brain, our neocortex as like you're being in an elevator with two mirrors. Opposing each other. Neurologists call it like there's one map of neurons that mirrors another map of neurons. That's what self-consciousness is. Now, when we experience the fear of non-mattering, what happens is that this mirrors, this infinitizes like a ping pong ball in that thing, fear. And so then we have absolute fears. And we create a God image that's full of absolute fears. And so what I'm saying, the role of religion with its rituals has an opportunity to calm that absolute fear, but it's through faith. Because when that absolute fear is there, it's like there's no ground anywhere under our feet. It's like you can go crazy. You can say there's just an abyss. And so faith is that instead of infinitizing fear, we can infinitize trust.
Yeah.
But for that to happen, there needs to be, in a way, a belief that there is abundance, and that abundance is grounded. And that is what, in many respects, Jesus talked about in many of his parables.
Yeah.
Like, the parables about the lost coin, or so on. What we have lost, we're afraid that we lost it, and
it's there.
It's there.
Yeah.
It's there. Or the hidden treasure.
Hidden treasure.
Or the way he, his whole ministry started, and this is something that can really calm the fear that is there, the existential fear. His ministry started with when the heavens opened, and he heard the voice, "You are my son, with you I'm well pleased." This is the beginning of his ministry. And this is what we should focus on. This is what he wanted to preach to everyone. That's why we're God's children. We all are God's children. This is what the church has to offer. It has to offer to help people calm this absolute anxiety, so that we don't have to act it out anymore. So that's personal work that has to happen, and then we can dismantle these forms of playing God, these forms of farming out insignificance, and let others be significant, because our significance is grounded in God.
Yeah. So it's in a sense, our message needs to be a set of I was going to say like an antidepressant gospel. Right?
Yes, an antidepressant gospel, also an anti-masochistic gospel. Yeah. We need to point out the injustices, but one of the you mentioned earlier the whole thing about all lives matter.
Yeah.
That itself, when people have that response, that is like, oh, you're telling me that when you say Black Lives Matter, that means that I don't matter. Yeah. No, that's not the point. The point is, that actually means we matter too, right? Which has so long not been emphasized. In fact, if we could all do that, then we could become more compassionate, right?
Yeah.
Become more compassionate. So People who are afraid that they don't matter need to be reassured, no, you matter. Use your fear of not mattering to be empathic with those that you treat as not mattering.
Yeah.
That would be empathy.
Yeah.
Right? With the least of these. It's not handouts. It's treating them with ultimate dignity.
Yeah. That there is value.
Yes, that they're absolutely valuable,
And
matter.
And by valuing them doesn't disvalue yourself.
No, see, that's the voice of the serpent is always, oh, if they matter, then you don't matter.
Yeah.
Knowledge of good and evil is really about knowing that you're naked and being ashamed of it. It's not a new knowledge. It's a way of knowing how you find it. We were finite in Genesis 2. It's an experience of that, like when they grabbed the fruit, or when we grabbed the fruit of racism, it doesn't give us new knowledge. It just it just creates horror for the whole world.
Yeah.
But it's an attempt to hide. It's like the fig leaf.
Yeah.
It's an attempt to hide our vulnerability. And so if we could use our vulnerability instead of coming together, if we could create communities where we can belong with our finitude,
Yeah.
that would be wonderful. Right?
That'd be awesome.
But we have to work through all the aggressions that are created as a result of this fear of not mattering. See, the aggressions that are in the system are because we're absolutely afraid that if they matter, we don't matter. We do the Cain and Abel thing.
Mm-hmm.
And so we have to stop that.
Yeah. Well, I really, really appreciate, and I can listen to you for another 2-3 hours.
Sure.
Of course. I'm really grateful for your time.
Yeah.
I really appreciate your analysis and how you are connecting a story that is familiar for people of faith in multiple traditions, and to understand how human behavior of fear has contributed and continues to contribute to racism today. Yeah. So thank you so much.
Yeah, you're welcome. And I'm teaching at Christian Theological Seminary, and I will actually this fall, I'll teach an intensive in October on spirituality and God images in counseling and culture. It's not just about counseling, and we will take a close look at this book here and some other writings. So yeah, thank you for having me.
Thanks so much.
Mm-hmm. Thank you.